Professor Majid Daneshgar, thank you for being with me on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Thank you for having me, Gabriel.
It's really good to see you. We've known each other for many years, but it feels like we've always been on opposite sides of the globe.
Yeah, exactly.
And we still are. We still are.
Yeah.
So I'm in my office in South Bend, Indiana, and it's nighttime here, and you're in Japan.
Yes, exactly, in Kyoto. Yeah.
And it's tomorrow for me. You're in tomorrow, and for you, I'm in yesterday.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking some time. We're going to speak. I'm hoping this will just be the first of a couple of episodes where we'll cover a number of topics. In this episode, hopefully we'll get in depth on the topic of scientific miraculousness and the Quran. So we'll speak about where the idea comes from, why it's so popular, and things like that. So yeah, you've had a series of articles out on this, so this is a great opportunity. I'll start with a really brief introduction, and then we'll get right into the topic of scientific miraculousness. Sound okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right, terrific. So friends, Professor Majid Daneshgar is Associate Professor of Area Studies at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto University in Japan. He is the author of Studying the Quran in the Muslim Academy, published in 2020 with Oxford University Press, and before that, Tantawi Jawhari and the Quran, published with Routledge in 2018. He's edited a really significant book, which was a festschrift for Andrew Rippin, that's right?
Yeah.
And
Festschrift for Rippin and festschrift for Peter Riddle, also.
Also for Peter Riddle, yeah. And his first book was translated into Arabic by the Human Foundation in Egypt. He's had award-winning articles, and most recently, among the many articles he's published, are 3 articles precisely on the topic for today, namely the Quran and Science. These are published with Zygon. I won't run through all of the titles because we want to get right into the topic, but they all are, the first title is the Quran and Science, and then they have different subtitles because they take us, I think, more or less historically through the origins of the idea of scientific miraculousness or scientific interpretation of the Quran up to the present day. That's
Yes.
more or less right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
Okay, so just if we plunge into this topic, which I think will be terrifically interesting to our friends who watch Exploring the Quran and the Bible, because it's just all over the Islamic world, the notion of scientific readings of the Quran, scientific miraculousness. Some people refer to Bucaillism because of Maurice Bucaille. We'll get to Bucaille. Some people speak of concordism and reading the Quran in a concordant manner with science. So to simplify, can we start just, what would be a simple definition for scientific miraculousness and the Quran?
Yeah, thank you. Scientific miraculousness of the Quran is be considered as a trend because it moved and developed over centuries. It says about that the Quran contains scientific information or scientific and historical information, which are necessarily limited to a specific period of time, but in over different periods, it can be applied to different periods of time. And also that it has a specific features like harmonious numerical analogies, which later was titled as Ijaz al-Adadi, or numerical miracles of the Quran. So these things are the main, definitions of scientific miracles of the Quran. Initially, people mainly focus on that Quran contains modern scientific findings, but within the last 20 years, the idea got changed and people added the idea of, historical information too, that the Quran had the potential to talk about historical events even before the emergence of Islam. So the accuracy they are compatible with historical, information or data that we achieved. So these are also part of the scientific miracleness of the Quran.
And I think we'll see as we go along that the branches of science which come into play when people speak about scientific miracles in the Quran are really varied. So
Exactly.
maybe the most famous example or the most repeated example has to do with the development of the embryo and the Quran, so sometimes called embryology, but also on geology, on different aspects of cosmology, Big Bang, string theory, all sorts of ideas. So we'll see the diversity of those ideas. How did you become interested in this topic? What led you to study it in depth? And do you have any anecdotes about your research?
I think it dates back when to many years ago when I was high school student. So we had a series of books of, Maurice Bucaille in Persian translation of Maurice Bucaille's book, The Bible, Quran, and Science, and also several other works by Iranians who wrote about the same topic even before Maurice Bucaille that I mentioned in the articles. So I became very much interested. At the same time, there were some debates about, those of Abdul Karim Surush in 1990s of Iran, encouraging people to think differently about the Quran, about prophetic traditions, about Sharia. On the other hand, we have philosophers who talk about philosophy of life, philosophy of religion, like Mustafa Malikian. So I was very interested in such topics. And at the same time, I became interested to learning more about the concept of life, the concept of death. So when I wanted to read about these issues, I also became interested in the concept of hope and religion, psychology and religion. So I was really interested in these topics. So I had all these, these works before my eyes. After that, during my master, I work on the Indian readings of Islam and science. I particularly focus on Zakir Naik. And Zakir Naik, the Quran and modern science, compatible or incompatible. And I even translated the book, and I also had a commentary on his reading of the Quran and science. And later, when I went for my PhD, what I was working on with Andrew Rippin mainly, and so we decided to work on have an analytical approach towards Maurice Bucaille and Tantawi Jawhari. So Maurice Bucaille, a French physician, on the other hand, Tantawi Jawhari. So it was very interesting, for me to see how people from outside of the Muslim world and the one inside the Muslim world, how they viewed science in the Quran. And that was the purpose of the main approach of in my PhD thesis. So it was the beginning of my journey, and then I started to systematically develop my works on the Quran and science, or religion and science, Darwinism, so on and so forth.
So going back to your studies in Iran, and your interest in science in the context of the Quran, religion, were you was this common? Were all your schoolmates also interested in this? Was there a general conviction that the Quran does have scientific miracles, and this is sort of a glorious feature of the text, which sort of verifies and confirms that it is a divine revelation? Or were you sort of seeing, like, I don't know, an outlier, like, oh, Majid has these strange interests in the Quran and science? How common was this interest?
I think it was very common at that time, and it still is common, but at that time was very common, mainly after post 1995, a number of religious figures, not scientists. For a long time, Iranian who wrote on Quran and science and scientific miracles of the Quran were mainly scientists who graduates of the West, who were like many other countries in the Muslim world, like Arabs. So many scientists started to write about scientific miracles of the Quran. But in 1990s, we had a few religious figures who did that in 1970s. I talk about them later. But in 1990s, people in Hausa and systematically started to write about this topic. Not only about, some of them wanted to prove the Quran is a miracle from a scientific perspective, but many of them also wanted to discuss the theories, engage with the discourse of the Quran and science. But that was a very great moment for Iranians, because religious people from Hausa, and some of them connected or affiliated with universities, started to produce something about the Quran and science, which was widely read by students in universities and by general public. We have, for example, Dr. Rezai Isfahani. His PhD thesis was about this one, and it was very revolutionary work. I remember that it was one of the, well-cited works in Iran at that time. I remember that it was translated, and people visiting Iran or Qom from different countries, from Africa, from Bosnia Herzegovina, and from other countries, they use his works. And yes, he did a great job at that time and changed the discourse, because before that one, we had Mehdi Golshani, who was a physicist, and he wrote in 1980s, he changed the discourse because he wrote in English first on Quran and nature, and he changed the discourse. Maurice Bucaille's idea was everywhere. But once Gulshani put forward that idea about Quran and nature, he wanted to create a balance between religion and science, and discouraging people to rely on scientific miraculousness. We had a very beautiful debate in the 1980s. And after that, we had Reza Isfahani in Iran as a religious figure, not as a scientist.
Yes.
Started to discuss it. But his ideas were discussed by both scientists and by both religious figures. And this is the point, that different communities from different disciplines started to get engaged with this idea of Reza Isfahani and his presentation of theories of the Quran and science.
Right. Okay. I think the viewers on Exploring the Quran and the Bible who may be more familiar with biblical studies and Quranic studies, it may be very curious for them to hear about the extent of interest in both. In a moment, we'll get to the distinction between scientific interpretation and scientific miraculousness, but the extent of interest in science and the Quran. I mean, for example, in my department, which is dominated by Catholic theology here at Notre Dame, a few of us do non-Christian religions. When people speak about science and theology, they mean how can scientific ideas, say evolution or new things about quantum theory, how can that reshape our theological thinking? They don't mean how do we how does science prove that our scripture is right or our tradition is right? So, and I know it's more complex. It's not only that in the Islamic context, but I mean, in reading your articles, that just the extent to which there's interest in this idea that science can prove that the Quran is God's word. It's remarkable. So anyway, before we speak more about the contemporary period, I wanted to get back to the origins of this. So where does this idea come from? How early do Muslims start thinking about the usefulness of science for the purpose of dawah or tabligh or apologetics?
This is, I mean, placing science in the discourse of Quranic studies, or in this discourse of Quran and Muslim literature, I think they should have been, initiated from the early period of Islam. And so right now we know that people, early Muslims were Arabs of Arab and Peninsula, at the turn of the 7th century and 8th century. They were familiar with some sort of knowledge. We have, for example, not only scientific knowledge and medical knowledge, but also across the borders of Saudi Arabia of today, people were quite familiar with medicine and pharmacology. For example, in southwest of Iran, Jundi Shapur had a physician whose name was Sabur ibn Sahl. Sabur ibn Sahl had created a site for practitioners, doctors and physicians who wanted to learn about medicine and pharmacology. His ideas were used for centuries by different hospitals, in different hospitals in the Muslim world. We have Harith ibn Kalada, who's known as the physicians of Arabs, at that time. And it is said that Prophet also admired him because of his medical knowledge. He said that he attended his courses, or he attended the place that Sabur ibn Sahl made in southwest of Iran. He was Christian, by the way. So this is what I wanted to say. So, and on the other hand, they had, they were quite busy with and engaged with husbandry, agriculture, farming. They had animals, herds, and so on. So they need to survive, right? They wanted to develop their herd. They wanted to be more stronger and wealthy and so on. So they created branding, culturizations, these scientific technologies. So in 1980s, there were some debates among some physicians and historians of science who wanted to say that what sort of scientific technologies were common in the Middle East at that time, in the Near East. But culturization and branding in order to stop injuries and bleeding and so on were common at that time. So it means that they knew something about science at that, you know? And so on the other hand, but the interesting aspect of scientific, it became part of Muslims' doctrine at the turn of the 10th century. So we know that in the 10th century CE is a very interesting, controversial period for Islam, because different schools of thought in Kalam, in theology emerged, and not only Sunni schools of thought, but also Shi'i ideas started to, penetrate everywhere. and later on ended up with the creation of different Sufi thoughts. So this is a very important period, and this period, several ideas are present, like inimitability or miraculousness of the Quran. The Quran as a miracle is challenging.
But you don't. So you have the idea of ijaz, and oftentimes that has to do with either knowledge in the Quran, predictions in the Quran, but often with the literary excellence of the Quran. But when do people start saying, "Oh, here's this scientific fact in the Quran that we now recognize because we're in the, I don't know, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, but it couldn't have been known in the 7th century." So that's what we commonly see in scientific miracle discourse. Maurice Bucaille says, we now know these things because we're in the 20th century, but no one could know this except for divine revelation in the 7th century. Therefore, it's miraculous. When does that?
You mean that, like the thing that, for example, Maurice Bucaille said, what do we have earlier one in the early period of Islam, right? I would say that in the 10th century, we should have such thing. Like Al-Khattabi, he's a jurist from Pusht of Afghanistan, and Pusht of Afghanistan used to be known as a Arabian of Khorasan. So he's named the place for Arabs of Khorasan because many people from Mecca, from Baghdad visited there. So he came from that region. He was a jurist and expert of hadith, and he referred to the idea of that Quran has he wrote on Ijaz al-Quran. So Ijaz, the concept of Ijaz, and the number of works about Ijaz started to be more and more and more. And he referred to the historical Ijaz, Ghulibatul Rum. So he referred to that verse of the Quran. So
which is Quran 30. Ijaz. Just to give context, this is Quran 30, right at the opening, which is traditionally interpreted to mean that the Romans have been defeated, but then they will conquer in a nearby land. I don't know the verse exactly. A nearby land in a few years. Yeah.
Yes.
But this is not.
So this is the historical Ijaz.
Exactly. This is historical.
Historical Ijaz. But once we go further, for example, in Fakhruddin al-Razi, in commentary of Fakhruddin al-Razi and Amana, he clearly says that, he mentions that the Quran is not the book of mathematics, arithmetic, medicine, and so on, but Quran is the key book for understanding of these sciences.
Okay.
He clearly mentioned this one. And this idea of Fakhruddin al-Razi is borrowed by Nizamuddin al-Nishaburi in his commentary on the Quran. So all of them had same meanings. And also we have...
now we're speaking about 13th century, about...
Yes. But it probably was initiated by Al-Ghazali, who refers to the ideas of Al-Ghazali. He says that God has the knowledge of human anatomy, skeleton, and so on. So these are the ideas of Al-Ghazali. But what you said, that they say that, so these are the only happened in the 7th century, that nobody had knowledge. I personally never came across this one.
Okay.
But I want to say that the idea of Ijaz, the Quran contains science, and scientific information emerged in the classical period. Since the 10th century, Muslim accepted this, that natural science or scientific knowledge was part of the Quran, because Ma farratna, right? This is what in the Quran mentioned, Ma farratna fil kitab min shay. So nothing has been omitted in the Quran. So they said that nothing has been omitted in the Quran, refer clearly, and one of them is scientific knowledge. And if you're going to have have idea about science, about medicine, physiology, and so on, one source that you can refer to is the Quran. And this is what Fakhruddin al-Razi, Nizamuddin Nishaburi, and many other commentators refer to since the classical period.
So is this how you would distinguish scientific interpretation from scientific miraculousness? How would you distinguish those two terms?
So in the past, the story is different. So some people assume that scientific interpretation and scientific miraculousness are not related, and some assume that the scientific miraculous is a radical output of the scientific interpretation.
Okay.
And but the point is that scientific interpretation is that you use science in order to interpret the Quran or explain a verse of the Quran by means of scientific information, like what had been done by Tantawi Jawhari for a long time, or Ahmed al-Iskandarani, and many others over the centuries. But both of them had the same idea in the classical period. In the 10th century, for example, the people who wanted to prove that Quran is a miracle, has knowledge about the past and future. And the guy, by the way, the guy Al-Khattabi also says that Quran has knowledge of future, mustaqbal. So he clearly says this issue. The people who supported the idea of scientific miraculousness and the people who supported the idea of scientific interpretation, that Quran can be interpreted by scientific knowledge. For example, when they wanted to say, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min 'alaq." So the way they interpreted 'alaq was, they all of them talked about the sperm as well as made of fluid and blood. So it means that they knew something about science.
So just to give the English of the Quran, you just read from, or you recited from Quran 96, by tradition, the first revelation of the Quran, which says, we created men from alaq, which is understood sometimes
alaq or congealed blood.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they say that so the process of the creation of human beings, you can see this if we only focus on this verse of the Quran and see and go through different commentaries, we can see that however from the beginning, if we consider, for example, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman could be one of the earliest commentators of the Quran, which is for me is very hard to believe it, or because the evidence are not that strong. I think just a piece
for
of
the authenticity of
so we consider that, hypothetically, that he's one of the first commentators of the Quran, and then you go to the 10th century, you can see more and more the ideas of, for example, alaq, and the way translated alaq and blood, sperm, and the formation of embryo are discussed throughout the century in different commentaries until the 17th century. All of them has one message, that all of these are prove or demonstrate the power of God on earth, or control God's authority over the universe. And then at the same time as this movement, we have, this is very interesting, that at the same time as we have the idea of that scientific knowledge in the Quran can support the idea of God's uniqueness and God's authority, Qudratullah. So at the same time, we have another idea, the emergence of a new genre in Muslim literature, which is prophetic medicine, Tibbun Nabawi, or Tibbun Nabi in Persian, or Tibbun Nabawi, prophetic medicine. At the same time, at 10th century, they started, 9th and 10th century, they started to select some, or ascribe time, some hadith or reports to Prophet Muhammad about medical things, herbs, olives, about, different the medical qualities of different elements. And this is interesting. Again, at this time, we have the idea of Shi'i started to follow what Sunni communities wanted to do, and then Risala Zahabiyya of ascribed to Ali ibn Musa Reza, the 8th Imam of Shia, and then they created the idea of Tibbul Riza, and so it is a parallel to Tibbul Nabawi. They have Tibbul Riza. All of them want to say something. Scientific interpreters and those the advocates of scientific miraculousness want to say all of them started to emerge and systematically act after the 10th century. So they wanted to follow the idea of Muhammad infallibility, is an isma of Muhammad. At the same time, the Quran is a miracle. So, and these 2 points play an important role and crucial role in scientific interpretations and ideas about miraculousness of the Quran since the early period of Islam up until the, I think, 19th century. But this idea get changed in the 19th century.
Okay, so one idea, sorry to jump in, but one idea I've always thought about in this regard is that the way that scientific miraculousness, so the specific argument that the Quran has scientific knowledge that could not have been known in the 7th century, and therefore it proves that the origin of this information is divine. That argument, I've always suspected that it's a response to, I don't know, like the cultural situation with European colonialism, imperialism, Christian missionaries on the ground in Islamic countries like Egypt, Iran, and India. And the idea that the West is sort of out there criticizing Islam, suspecting Islam of backwardness, of primitiveness. And so to assert scientific miracles in the Qur'an is a way to sort of undermine the arguments of these Westerners, these imperialists, colonialists, missionaries, to say, no, the Qur'an is actually the scientific scripture. There's nothing you can discover that we can't find already in the Qur'an. What do you think about that argument?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right. Okay. References to natural things or phenomena in the Bible are a lot, and you can find plenty of them in the Bible.
Yes.
And so from the beginning, Christian scholars were interested to talk about those things. And if you go through the literature, through manuscripts, mainly those when I found in Cambridge University Library, plenty of medical manuscript, belong to Christian thinkers.
Okay.
They use biblical literature and they place them next to medical issues. It was very common at that time.
Okay.
So I want to say that it was also the concern of non-Muslims too.
Also
to
Christians. Okay.
The relation, yeah, also Christians, Judeo-Christians as well. What at the turn, during the colonial period, this is what I want to say. I would say that every single step already taken by, colonial officers or Europeans to interpret the Bible and science through scientific perspective or placing science next to the Bible was also followed by Muslims. So, for example, so when Tantawi Jawhari want to talk about, physical resurrection and the day of judgment, so he follows, the methods of Christian thinkers. He refers to Christian thinkers, and also another good example mainly about scientific miraculousness is Dr. David, with the German name of David Macht. So he was professor, or he was a pharmacologist. He studied Hebrew literature too. He was in New York. He started to write about the Bible and science. And he started to be a big, he wrote critical statements about scientific translations of the Bible. He asked people, if you want to translate the Bible, you need to be well equipped with science of medicine and physiology. And he started to produce a set of articles and books about blood circulation and the Bible. Okay. He was very influential. He attracted a lot of Jewish figures to write about the Bible and science. He was a fundamental figure.
He was Jewish himself, David Macht.
David Macht, yeah. And what he did was exactly the way he produced or wrote about the Bible and science. Scientific translations of the Bible, you can see, are evident in the works of Maurice Bucaille. So this is what I want to say. So at that time, before Muslims want to do something, Europeans already wrote a lot about the Bible and science. And this is interesting. Scientific journals in the West, like the Journal of Nature wrote about this one, the Bible and science. They publish about the Bible and science. Astronomers, scientists, physicists from the Christian world and Judeo-Christian circles, they started to write in such topics. They received huge grants at that time from different foundations, religious foundations, to write about the Bible.
That there's this sort of consistency between the latest scientific findings and what the Bible.
Exactly. They had the concern of scientific miraculousness, and they wanted to say that the Bible is the mine of modern information.
Yes.
And the Bible is not only compatible with science, but also is the mine of information. And exactly the same strategy that had been done in the Muslim world. They wanted to say, in Muslim world, they wanted to say that Prophet is the mine of information, right? He knows the secret, divine secrets. This is exactly
which is why you have this science that you spoke of, Tibb al-Nabawi.
Exactly.
And the medicine, the prophetic medicine. Yes.
Exactly. In Tafsir Kashf al-Asrar by Maybudi, so he clearly says that. So different prophets had different knowledge. For example, Jesus had the knowledge of medicine, but Muhammad had the secret the knowledge of secrets. You know, out means everything actually. So this happened in Christian and biblical literature. I mean, biblical circles too. I mean, like Macht and other physicians and scientists, and they wanted to say Moses is a perfect, knowledgeable scientist. They wanted to do so, and they did so. And they clearly explained that Moses had the knowledge when they went through the Talmudic literature. They wanted to confirm that Moses was very knowledgeable. He knew everything, and you know, as a reliable and trustable messenger of God. We have a same scenario in Islam.
But does this mean that the Muslim thinkers who begin to advance in maybe the early 20th century, maybe a bit earlier, you could correct me, begin to advance the notion of scientific miracles, that they're not only responding against missionaries, colonial powers, imperial powers, but they're also learning tricks of the trade from the way that these missionary thinkers are using science in their discourse. So they're at once responding to, but also borrowing from Western thinkers.
Exactly, this ambivalence can be seen.
Okay.
So it should be noted that in the 19th century, we have very few references to the concept of scientific miraculousness.
Right.
Very few. In the 19th century, for example, we Ahmed al-Iskandarani, and again, a physician. So you can see that physicians play an important and starting role. Before Muhammad Abdo, before Tantawi Jawhari, we have physicians, Muslim physicians who are familiar with French science. They read French literature very well. They knew French. They were part of the Ottoman army, Ottoman navy, like Ahmed al-Iskandarani. He was really good, and he published his first book, Kashf al-Asrar al-Nuraniya. So he published his first book in Egypt, and then he moved to Ottoman Syria. And he died in Ottoman Syria, by the way. And he published the rest of his works in Ottoman Syria. He's the first that he systematically discussed or interpreted Quranic verses by means of science. And the science that he used are really interesting. He referred to French literature, to French zoology, and so on and so forth. But he rarely talk about whether, I mean, Europeans are superior than us or not. He said very few. But once you reach Tantawi Jawhari, who started to write about Islam and science since 1899, he became very much interested in English literature. As I said in the article, he supervised his students to translate the, English nursery poems into Arabic, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So he translated them into Khitab al-Najm. So he translated them into Arabic. He was very much interested in reading about Darwin, Lubbock's articles and Lubbock's work on pleasure of life. But at the same time, he started to say that Christians cannot be successful unless they refer to holy text that is Islamic text, is the Quran. And this is interesting because Tantawi Jawhari is and even once I have this here, so even once he wants to talk about science and the Quran, he used scientific photography, which in the 19th century was a method and technology used by Darwin, for example, in his book Expression of Emotions. And he also used them. Look, is a tafsir, but it's like a,
wow,
it's an album of very beautiful album of different scientific findings.
Yeah. So can I just jump in to ask specifically about Darwin? I mean, Darwin sort of rocks the Western world, and there are all sorts of consequences because obviously on scientific questions, but it leads to social Darwinism, et cetera, et cetera. And it also leads to a religious crisis and division among theologians about how to integrate this with traditional ways of reading scripture in Genesis in particular. Does it influence, is it a problem for Muslim thinkers? Do they pay attention to Darwin? Do they try to rethink how the Quran speaks of God's creation of man from dirt, which it does, repeatedly, turab? So what is the influence of Darwin on this discourse of science in the Quran?
This is interesting because even before, Darwin, like Ahmed al-Iskandarani, he was familiar with some evolutionary debates in French circles, in French medicine. He referred to the name of some scientists and zoologists French zoologists. And after that, so Darwin also talked about this issue. He does not mention the name of Darwin, but he referred to the idea of evolution.
Okay.
And out of blood. But Tantawi Jawhari was very much interested in Darwin, but because you know that before Tantawi Jawhari write about Darwin, we have Jamaluddin al-Afghani, or also Asadabadi. He's known also Asadabadi. So Jamaluddin al-Afghani or Asadabadi, whose real name is al-Husseini. So this guy also, he was asked by someone known as Muhammad Wasil. He was a mathematician in India. He asked him about the such naturalist movement across India. He had questions about the origin of human beings, and Jamaluddin al-Afghani rejected this idea, and he said they are materialists, and he said that Darwin is one of these materialists. So this is the beginning. This idea was translated by his fellow Muhammad Abdu and someone else into Arabic and circulated across the Muslim world. So people right now knew something about Darwin, but at the same time, Shibli Shumayl, I was a Christian, I was Arab from Lebanon, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Shibli Shumayl also promoted the ideas of Darwin. So we have a contradiction, or the two different groups stood against each other. Okay. Followers of Darwin and the rejectors or deniers of Darwin. So these debates since the late 19th century. Marwa al-Shakri wrote a lot about this issue. Her book on reading Darwin in Arabic was wonderful.
Okay, great research. So,
yeah, I think
I remember receiving, this is to fast forward in time, but I remember receiving in my office here at Notre Dame, maybe 17, 18 years ago, a book by someone named Harun Yahya, who I later learned is actually, I think, Adnan Oktar. Is that
Adnan, yeah.
Yeah, against Darwin. And there was a major effort to send out these books to different Western academics because they had been translated into English, I assume, from Turkish. So he features, do you have a word about Harun Yahya? I know it's sort of out of context because we're fast forwarding to the early 21st century. But he continued to, and maybe still today, I don't know, argue against the scientific legitimacy of Darwin and to argue that Darwinism has all sorts of negative consequences on society.
Yeah, this is what I know, that, for example, so Harun Yahya is a showman, so influential. Right now, I think he's been silent for a few years, but what he has produced had influence even on the people who are advocates of atheism, like Richard Dawkins. So he talked about the Harun Yahya's and his presentation of anti-Darwinism.
Okay.
Yes. Again, Harun Yahya, once you go through his work, the message, so many people wrote about Harun Yahya. So what I want to say that, and what I've done in this article is not only to follow up on former studies, but also to add further materials from unknown areas like Bengal, like Malay Indonesian world, like Shi circle, like Sufi. But Harun Yahya is very well examined by former scholars. So, but once you go through the works of Harun Yahya, you can see he also echoed the works or the statements of former scholars or supporters of miraculous aspect of the Quran or scientific aspect of the Quran, that ultimate message is that to prove God, the uniqueness of God and God's authority over the universe. And also at the same time, they want to say that Muhammad is the final prophet and infallible. So he also, followed this theological approach. And I don't think that not only Darwin, whoever gonna say something like that, so his approach is same, because this is the fixed things in the discourse of the Quran and science. Most Muslims apply these elements in order to support the things of uniqueness of the Quran and infallibility of Muhammad. So there was a main strategy used by all these people over the centuries.
Yes. Well, let's speak about a few specific individuals. We have to get to Maurice Bucaille. That's like necessary. We've got to get to Bucaille. We can't avoid it. But before we do, some earlier figures you mentioned in your articles in the journal Zygon, right? The name of the journal where you've published these articles. So I was interested to learn about someone named Abdul Razak Naufal, who spoke, I think about the numerical, what he sees as the numerical miracles of the Quran, and then you connect that with a figure who I think was active in the United States, but maybe an Egyptian, Rashad Khalifa. Am I right? He was in the U.S., but originally from Egypt.
So yeah, both of them were Egyptians. Abdul Razak, but this is interesting. Abdul Razak Nawfal, I mean, he. So once we're going to consider his approaches to science in the Quran, we should, even his numerical miraculousness of the Quran, we should see along with other works that he produced. He wrote on al-arwah, or spirit, human spirit. He wrote on medicine. He wrote on Quran and modern science. One of them was in a series of his work that he produced, like many others of that time in 1970s, 1980s. It was a revolutionary movement. Not only, we can talk about what happened in Iran and Shia circles too, but Abdul Razak, what he produced was numerical miracles of the Quran, and he wanted to say that there is a coherency. I mean, for example, he wanted to say 115 times the term ad-dunya wal-akhirah. These, I mean, each of them are repeated. You know, each of them repeated
amount. Yeah, in his reading,
exactly 115 times.
Yes.
And he also found it for summer and warmness, I mean, winter and coolness, and different, phrases. He found a, parallel of each other. And it was very interesting because what Abdul Razak Nawfal mentioned, used by, promoters of Islam and in Dawah, missions. And still, I mention it. I added some YouTube links in my article that you can see.
It's still used. You still find these.
Yeah, new converts. Yeah, apply the ideas of Nawfal in order to say that, okay, this is the Quran as a holy text, as a miracle. Why don't you convert? So this is commonly used, And this idea also made inroads to the United States. And the history of the United States, mainly the eastern side of the United States and the way it engaged with science in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Ismail al-Faruqi we have, and then the idea of Islamization of knowledge. And then we have this guy, Rashad Khalifa, who was assassinated.
Khalifa is sort of on the margins of this whole story because he makes very extraordinary, controversial claims about himself, right?
Yes, exactly.
And you were about to say he's ultimately murdered.
Rashad Khalifa?
Yes.
Or the other? Both of
Rashad
them,
Khalifa.
Yeah, Rashad Khalifa was assassinated. He was assassinated in 1990, and he was a scientist, very interesting person. Some people assume that he was a Quranist, a movement very common in the 19th century and 20th century Cairo, like Muhammad Tawfiq Sidqi, who only relied on the Quran, al-Quraniyun, right? Quranist.
Yes.
So he's also, they said that he was also a Quranist. He wanted to promote the Quran, and he tried to find some codes, numerical codes in the Quran, that like the code of 19, for example, he shows that the opening statement of the Quran consists of 19 letters. The first chapter, Quran 96, according to him, the Surah Al-Alaq.
First revelation, yes.
Yes, it consists of 19 words, and the latter chapter, Quran 110, Surah Al-Nas, consists of 19 words, and the Quran consists of 114 chapters, and 114 is a multiple of 19. So such method. But the point is that once you go through the book, you can see that he said all these are an instrument to show that God is only one, the uniqueness of God, which is again the message of Islam, right? Wahid, Tawheed. So all of them revolve around these notions. Indeed, science for Muslims from the beginning to date, the people who want to be advocate of scientific miraculousness with scientific interpretation, science is an instrument for them in order to support the uniqueness of God and base Islamic teachings, mainly prophecy of Prophet Muhammad. And when I said that, for example, at the turn of the 10th century, we have the creation, and after that, we have the creation of the genre of prophetic medicine. At the same time, we have A'lam al-Nubuwwah, right? The genre of the proofs of prophecy.
Yes.
So all of them happen at the same time. So once they want to prove the prophecy of Muhammad, at the same time, you can see afterwards, you can notice the emergence of prophetic medicine.
Yeah, and I think that that parallel continues in the contemporary period, because the great excitement that you can see on the internet about scientific miracles in the Quran is accompanied by great excitement around the personal, social, political, economic ideas of Muhammad himself. So, I mean, you see this in circles of, as you mentioned, Islamic missions or dawah, that his personal qualities, redound to or reflect or point to his prophethood ultimately.
Exactly.
By the way, another random fact, maybe you know this, but this, if I'm not mistaken, the son of Rashad Khalifa was a great baseball player, was a sensational baseball player, and I believe he made it to the professional leagues.
Wow.
There was a feature on him in the New York Times, the son of Rashad Khalifa. I believe Rashad Khalifa married a non-Muslim American woman, and his son grew up playing baseball and was a big superstar. But something tragic, not only his father's murder went on, and there's a really interesting feature. I don't remember all the details. Okay, on to another figure in the Shiite Iranian world, very important figure in politics and in religious thought, is Mehdi Barzagan, who, as you mentioned in your article, became the first prime minister after the revolution, I think, in Iran.
Yes.
He's known in Quranic study circles for his chronological categorization of the Quran, and that's been used and is sort of in vogue in certain circles, even in Western Quranic studies. But he was interested in scientific miracles or the Quran and science, and he wrote about things like wind and rain and other medical ideas in the Quran. What else should we know about Mehdi Barzagan and his Quran and science?
Can I say a few about the Shia circles before reaching Barzagan?
Okay.
So what I want to say that one main area in the discourse of the Quran and science, I mean, usually overlooked in such literature, is that in the 19th century and 20th century, one of the main centers for the promotion of the Quran and science, either scientific interpretation and scientific miraculousness, is Cairo in Egypt, right? This one, and after that, in the late 20th century, let's say after 1970s, this position is given to Saudi Arabia, as it becomes the pole or the main hub for scientific miraculousness.
They host established organizations, foundations, conferences, journals. Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. But in the middle of this one, I mean, for 30, 40 years, Shi'i were quite active.
Okay.
Those Shi'i circles. And one of the main places was Iraq, in Baghdad and Najaf and Karbala.
Right.
So, for example, the works and other works on, so people since 19th and early 20th century, people wrote against Darwinism or about Darwinism. Iranians of Iraq, so Persian background, had Persian background, they wrote against or about Darwin. And after that, we had physicians, Iraqi physicians, who wrote about Shi'i imams and medicine, like Tibbu Sadiq, which I think deserve to be examined for a PhD thesis or something like that, which is quite interesting.
Which is the medicine of Ja'far as-Sadiq?
Ja'far as-Sadiq, and is very common across the Muslim, Shi'i lands. Mainly in Iran, you can find. I know that in Lebanon and some part of the Shia communities, you can find it. But essential part in many Shi'i, many houses in Iran, you can find it. And the point is that some people assume that, yes, the idea was taken from some classical treatises and classical manuscripts and works ascribed to Ja'far as-Sadiq, but the concept of medicine of Ja'far as-Sadiq was created in the 20th century, as far as I know. And was an Iraqi physician, Al-Khalili. He wrote this book, and this became fundamental. And even sometimes its reputation was more than Tibbu Riza, the medicine of the 8th Imam of Shia. So it was very interesting. So during these periods, Iraq was, and they also reproduced the works of Tibbu Riza in Iraq too. So they were quite busy with the materials about the Quran and science, Shiism and science. And after that, so that was, the context of Shi'i world. And so Barzagan also, who relied a lot on Shi'i materials too, he also had some ideas about the reputation, about the way the number of arih or riyah, means the wind or the winds, are mentioned, how many times mentioned in the Quran. So he had such ideas. So then these number, for example, the frequency refers to the importance of this one and the way it can, improve environment and had influence on rainings and then land fertility and so on and so forth. And when he wanted to talk about religion and science or Quran and science, he also relied on French materials, because he graduates of French universities, and he referred to French materials, different scientific work produced by French scholars and scientists. So this is what I want to say. Again, the method used by Tantawi, method used by Abdul Razak Naufal and many others who took many things from the West, and then in order to explain the meaning of the Quran was also applied by Bazargan. Bazargan was a scientist again.
Okay.
And the number of scientists, physicians, like Faqihi Shirazi or Niyazman, they were scientists or historians, some of them, they interested in this topic was very common at that time. Doctors in Iran wrote about these topics, about medicine and Islam, medicine, the Quran and, for example, environment, Quran and women and so forth. They wrote a lot. But the point which I think was a starting point for, encouraging people that religious figures in Iran can engage with Quran and science discourse was the works of a young clergy at that time was Bi-Azar Shirazi. So Bi-Azar Shirazi, I have his book here. So just a moment. So it should be here. Oh, yes, here. So Bi-Azar Shirazi, this one.
Okay.
So, yeah. So he said, گذشته و آینده جهان. So past and future of the world. He wrote about travel to space. He wrote about psychology, about medicine. One of the bestseller author of that time. I think in one of the magazines and newspapers, I read that he was one of the bestseller, authors of that time because of this book. And these published, this is important. He wrote about embryology in the Quran and the way he said that, for example, في ظلمات ثلاث in the Quran.
Three darknesses, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Three darknesses.
Folded in three darknesses, yes.
Exactly. And he clearly referred to scientific information, which later was used by, or also referred to by Keith Moore and other embryologists. So he produced this work in early 1970s, long before Bucaille and
yes.
So this is what I wanted to say. The discourse is very much, the Quran and science discourse is very much Sunni-centric. And because of that, people rarely refer to
know that all of this literature is being produced in Shia circles. It's very interesting. And just to stick with the Shi Iranian Iraqi context for a moment, do you have the sense that this is sort of a bottom-up movement, that there's sort of, I don't know how to put this, but like authentic enthusiasm among scientists and young religion students about this whole idea? Or are there, especially after the revolution, sort of official foundations or institutes or universities which are actively funding and maybe seeking to champion this sort of knowledge? Do you know what I mean? Is it coming? Is it coming top down, where there are people who have religious agendas who are funding and encouraging this research for their own personal interests, or is it coming bottom up, where people are just so religious and they love the Quran and they get excited about this, that it's just sort of authentic and original? Does that make sense, that question?
I think if you ask me about recent decades, yes, I think this is a bottom up. But in the past, no, I think it was very much supported from, by authorities or religious parties. Okay. But right now, many graduates we have, in scientists we have in Iran, graduates of universities, they became interested in such topics and they get engaged very well. We have we should see that. The popularity of the Quran and science since 1990s,
yes,
I think is very much related to the works of, I think it was in your university, Alvin Plantinga, right?
Yes.
So philosophy of religion, giving sense to religion, seeing religion through a philosophical perspective, interpreted philosophically. So many people who study mathematics, science, they went and they studied philosophy of religion. Many of them are my friends who are really good or became analytic philosophers. At the same time, they have very good knowledge of Islam and Islamic texts. And we should admit that in 1990s, the works of Ian Barber on religion and science, was translated into Persian by Bahauddin Khurramshahi, was revolutionary, encouraged many philosophers to get engaged with the Quran and science.
Okay.
If you ask me, I would say that recent decades, 1 or 2 decades ago, since our last 2 decades, the number of people working on this is spontaneous. This is a bottom-up approach. They want the people, the students, younger generation, because of different access to different materials, became engaged with science and Quran. But in the past, at the turn of the revolution, I think there should have been some support from government or authorities who really wanted to support the idea of the Quran and science in order to prove the infallibility of the Prophet as well as Shi imams. And this is why that you can, when you go through the works of Bazargan, you can see references to Shi imams too.
Imams as well. What about moving outside of Iran to, and specifically to Saudi Arabia, but maybe there are other examples. And I want to get to Zakir Naik. We don't have too much time. We still have to get to Maurice Bucaille and Zakir Naik. Those are both necessary stops. But if you look at Saudi Arabia, I don't know, someone who's skeptical or cynical could say, well, Saudi Arabia, you have this agenda of folks who have lots of money, and there's a sort of prestige in funding the sort of scholarship that, leads to glorifying Islam, celebrating Islam, championing Islam, making the Quran seem better than the Bible, defending Islam against secular materialistic science. So you have, some millionaires in Saudi Arabia who are donating large amounts of money, or maybe zakat money is going to this sort of project of establishing a journal, establishing a YouTube channel, establishing a website. And so do you see there in Saudi Arabia more top-down? Do you see more sort of foundations that are trying to
I think it used to be
orient scholarship in this direction?
I think it used to be like that, but right now I think it started to get changed. It's more bottom-up. It's like many other places, people in different disciplines became interested in this topic, not necessarily because of the the top-down, the governmental support or authority support. But I think this is, at that time, probably used to be like that, like many other places, like in Iran. There was a competition, actually, who's going to be the leader of the Muslim world, I think, at that time.
Yes.
Once you go, since pre-revolution, even pre-revolution of Iran, there are some ideas about that. I noticed some documents in Malaysia that the Shah of Iran, when he was in Malaysia, he wanted to promote the idea of Islamic League or Muslim Brotherhood. He had such ideas. And I published an article about this one. At the same time, King Faisal, he wanted to do the same.
The same thing.
And Maurice Bucaille emerged during the time of King Faisal, right?
Yes.
Many people
and Bucaille himself, if we shift to Bucaille for a second, Bucaille himself was in Saudi Arabia. Wasn't he a physician to the royal family or?
Royal family first in Anwar Sadat, president of Egyptian president.
Okay.
And then it is said, to be honest, it is very hard for me to confirm this. It is said that he was attached to royal family of Arabia, but people are still hesitant to say exactly this one.
Okay.
But we know about Khithmur that he was in a hospital. He worked for hospitals in Saudi Arabia. He worked with colleagues there, and they produced articles in a series of articles about medicine and Quran. So he was one of the main contributors. So about Bucaille, the story is, I think, we should talk about it.
Yeah, yes. How does Bucaille become present in every bookstore in the Islamic world, translated into so many languages? You mentioned, I think, reading a Persian version as a young man of his work, the Bible, the Quran, and Science, originally written in French, of course, but soon translated into so many languages. Why would this fellow sort of a mystery? I've watched the lecture on YouTube that you speak about in your article that he gave in Chicago, with his very heavy French accent when speaking in English. How does this guy, it's not clear if he ever became a Muslim. You sort of suggest in your article that he didn't, I think, although some people say he did. But why is he more popular than the dozens of Muslim scholars who have worked on this topic that you mentioned? What's his story?
I think, so first about his conversion to Islam. There has been debates whether he converted to Islam or not. Some people interviewed his wife they didn't have any answer about this issue, tried to find his gravestone to find about this issue and so on. But the point is that in one interview that he had with Al-Azhar University's magazine, and later this interview was translated into Persian in 1980s. Once they ask about his ideas about Islam and Islamic principles, it says that Muhammad is a messenger of God. So, which is Muhammad Rasulullah. So, and there is only one God. He clearly says this issue. If we rely on the interview text, we don't know. I mean, the transcription of the interview. But if we rely on that one, probably he converted. Based on this interview, but we don't know. But about the way he became very popular, I think one of the main reasons was that he minimized the Bible. That was the main,
okay, so he brings them together, not only elevates the Quran, but also brings down the Bible.
And this is his strategy, I think, very well. I mean, I don't know, the way he minimized the Bible. But, the problem was that the people, at that time, there was, the media was silent about other people working on science and religious texts. They didn't know about David Macht, that he did the great job with the Bible and science. And plenty of other, scientists who wrote about the Quran, about the Bible and science. So Maurice Bucaille.
So let me ask a very frank question, Majid, about Maurice Bucaille. We read Bucaille with my students at Notre Dame, and I have a few Muslim students, but mostly non-Muslim, mostly Christian, and most of those are Catholics. And a lot of them, because it's a required course to do theology, so a lot of them are coming from the sciences, and they sit in my classroom. There was actually, I had a Muslim student from the Gulf, from the Abu Dhabi, I think, last year, and there was some conflict in the class because overwhelmingly the students read Maurice Bucaille, my students, and they find it very weak, just so weak. I mean, so he says, I don't know, Surah Al-Ankabut, Surah 29, it says the spider's house is the weakest of houses or something. And then he writes something about, this scientifically proves, because we now know that the fabric of a spider's web is such and such. And they just find this, like, is this serious scholarship? Like, anyone could say that. Like, there's no science here. So how is it that my non-Muslim students, so I said, very frank question, my non-Muslim students are so unimpressed by Bucaille, and he's so sensationally impressive in so many places in the Islamic world. I mean, I don't think all Muslims are. There must be people who don't like him and feel like there are more sophisticated ways to speak about the Quran and science. But I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there because of my experience here at Notre Dame.
Yeah. I think, yes. Some aspects of that is about description of some elements, natural elements in the Quran, but on the other hand, he wants, for example, hydrology. He want to talk about the circulation of water. He refers specifically to the verses of the Quran, and then he put forward some historical information. For example, he says that the idea of circulation of water, for example, in the West, we have it after the 15th and 16th centuries. But what Quran says, for example, let me see. Chapter 23, Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse 18. وَأَنزَلْنَا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً بِقَدَرٍ فَاسْكَنَّاهُ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَإِنَّا عَلَى ذَهَابٍ بِهِ لَقَادِرُونَ. So this is what he says, that, for example, he clearly says that we sent down rain from the sky in perfect measure, and then causing it to soak into the earth, and we surely able to take it away. So he considered it as a circulation of water, and it's related to science of hydrology. And because, this is the point, he created context. He says that this one established in Europe after 16th or 17th century. Yeah. So, but you look at the Quran that it says long time ago. So this comparison, encouraging the people who are admirers of the Quran to support this idea. Okay. But I want to say this, if you go through the works of David Macht, and other Christians or Jews who wrote about the Bible and Quran, or Talmudic literature, the Bible and science, or Talmudic literature and science, you can see similarities. They had the same concern.
Similar styles of arguing. Okay.
Very similar. And
that makes sense.
Because also, that Maurice Bucaille wrote something against blashers and
translations. Yeah, he
their
often.
friend.
Yeah, I think Hamidullah, right? Muhammad
Hamidullah.
the
Hamidullah and
Pakistani,
Blasher.
Pakistani.
So this
French
happened
translator.
for even in biblical literature. I mean, David Macht also did the same. And
Yeah, you have to change the translation.
Yeah.
Like there's a famous debate over his bit about the fluids of the man and the woman mixing, and what it comes from the ribs, but he says, oh, that word tara'ib doesn't actually mean ribs, it has to mean something. So he does a lot of work with the translation to advance his arguments. Because there's not that much time, I wanted to ask you specifically about an anecdote you relate in the article about another Western scholar who it seems did not intentionally seek to advance scientific miracle arguments in regard to the Quran. This is Alfred Kröner. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. And you in your article, can you say it?
I think in German is Alfred Kröner.
Okay. So that guy.
No, I'm sorry. Just yes.
Yeah. No, thank you. So in that in the article, you mentioned that he became exceptionally popular in Islamic media, websites, things, because of a lecture he gave in 1979 in Saudi Arabia. And it seems from your conversation with him, because you spoke to him, I think in 2016, that he was kind of surprised that he became so popular. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I remember that whenever he was very common in YouTube channels, and Az-Zindani, Sheikh Az-Zindani, I mean, he also interpreted his comments into Arabic and his ideas, and the video of Sheikh Az-Zindani and Zindani on the ideas of Corona Alpha was, commonly used by people, conversion agencies in Europe who wanted to convert non-Muslim to Islam, right? And his idea, and he received plenty of emails from his friends, and he was really sad about this issue, to be honest. He died a few years ago, unfortunately, but I have his email and the way he answered me. And so he said that in 1979, with a number of geologists, they visited Saudi Arabia, because they were invited by, I have a note here, attended a geological conference in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and there was a television interview with 5 Western geologists organized by the Minister of Religious Affairs, who had a PhD in geology. The issue was whether the Quran was compatible with modern views on the evolution of the earth. As you can imagine, there are always aspects in religious writings that are compatible with nature, and the Quran is not exception. The citation that you now find on these religious sites, like the one that is admired by Sheikh Landani, are taken out of context. I cannot even remember details of the interview. In any case, whatever you find on these sites are surely never said as it is coded now. There is little I can do about it. I asked several friends in the Islamic world for advice. So it means that he was not happy with this issue. And they all said just to leave it and live with it. But the point is that it happened to Maurice Bucaille. You know that once Maurice Bucaille wrote that book, many people assumed that, and they call her as a scientist, and they showed the S of scientist with the sign of dollar, US dollar. And they said that he received huge amount of money, oil money, to write that book. We don't know about this issue, about the accuracy, because these were the people like him or Keith Moore. He tried to contact him. He never responded back. So they are silent about what had happened at that time. But the point is that this is the many people who engaged with this project in 1970s and 80s. Many of them started to say that this is not actually the whole story. The whole story is different. And there were some ideas to take part of these statements and attach them to the discourse of the Quran and science promotion of Quran in Dawah programs.
So interesting, Majid. I'm so sorry, but I think we should wrap things up for now. I really hope we can convince you to come back to exploring the Quran and the Bible. I want to just remind the audience of 2 of your books, which the first one is on a figure whom we've spoken about in this interview, Tantawi Jawhari in the Quran, that's published by Routledge in 2018. and a terrific book, which we're going to get to, I hope, in a subsequent interview, Studying the Quran in the Muslim Academy. That's with Oxford University in 2020. And find these 3 articles. They may be on academia. Is that right? The articles?
Yes, I placed them on academia, yeah. But the Zayden Journal is going to be an open access source from January. So it's going to be open access wholly.
Perfect.
Available.
Okay. So again, look for Majid Daneshgar on academia to find those articles titled The Quran and Science. In their 3 parts, you'll see them all there. Incredibly interesting. Has, as you mentioned during the interview, you don't simply revisit the characters who are well known, but introduce new aspects from diverse elements of the Islamic world far outside of the countries that we usually hear about, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. You speak about the Malay Indonesian world, Iran, all sorts of South Asian contexts as well. So can very briefly before we wrap up, do you have a current project or future projects that we should know about?
Well, in Quranic projects, if I want to say, I've been working on my new book, which is about Vansbro. It is about the whole story of Vansbro and his life, his library, his Quranic studies project, and the aftermath of its publication. So it's supposed to be a critical work. And so adding new information about him, his library, and the way he had influence on different corners of the world.
Great.
And the other one is about Thomas Penius, the 17th century Dutch Arabist.
Super exciting projects. Wonderful. Majid, thank you so much. Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Cheers.